This little black dress is simple to make and can be worn with or without a belt. You could even use a satin sash if you wanted to around your waist. You will need to use a fabric, the weight of crepe or a lightweight wool. A stable woven fabric will give you the best results. Using sharp scissors, notch all your seam, hem allowances and darts. Using a pin, mark the point of the dart, both darts. If you find that difficult, use a hand sewing needle and thread, making sure you mark both dart points. If you've used a pin and you've pinned it from both sides, when you pull the centre front apart, the pins will stay in position. Lift the pattern and pin the darts into position. Take the back pattern piece off and pin the centre back from the split to the neck edge, right sides together. Take the pattern pieces from the facing and pin at shoulders and the centre back seam, again right sides together. Sew the darts from the outside edge to the point. Reverse the machine directly over your stitching line to reinforce the point. You may like to just sew off the end of the dart and the machine naturally twists the thread so that it will stay in position. Sew the centre back seam from the notch for the split to the neck edge. Neaten these seams using a slight zigzag. Make sure you neaten them separately. If you have an overlocker, you may choose to use the overlocker instead. You zigzag this seam separately because there's a split at the back and you need to be able to press that seam open. Sew the shoulders of the dress with right sides together and repeat with the shoulders of the facing. No need to neaten these as they are covered by the facing. Don't sew the side seams of the facing or the dress as yet. It is easier to put the facing onto the neck and armhole if you leave these seams open. Press the dart value down towards the hem and the centre back and shoulder seams open. Pressing as you go will give you a much neater and more professional finish. With right sides together, pin the facing to the dress at the neck edge. Stitch the facing to the neck edge on the seam allowance line. Trim the seam allowance back. Turn through to the right side and edge stitch. Edge stitching is when you pull the seam open with the seam allowance sitting underneath it and stitch right on the edge. Have the seam allowance under the facing and stitch right on the edge of the neck edge seam. This helps hold the facing back when you turn it through. Press and pin the facing to the dress at the armhole. If there is any facing extending past the dress armhole, trim it off to match. If you don't do this, the facing will roll out to the front. It is better if the facing is a little bit smaller than the dress, but cutting them to match will do. Now this is the tricky bit. At the shoulder seam, fold the seam allowance of the facing and the dress in towards each other and pin right on the very edge. You must pin right on the very edge. This pin will hold them together while you reach up between the facing and the dress towards the shoulder edge. Grab the seam allowance and pull it out to the outside. You will then be able to pin and sew the armhole from the shoulder to the side seam. Don't sew all the way to the side seam. Finish about 5 centimetres or 2 inches short. This is so we can finish off the side seam and the facing later. Trim the armhole seam allowance and pull back through so you have the garment and facing sitting as they will be when your dress is finished. Now reach up inside the facing and dress from the opposite side of the armhole, pull it out, pin and stitch through to the side seam, again leaving 5 centimetres or 2 inches short of finishing the seam. Trim the seam allowance, turn back to the outside. Repeat this with the other armhole. Your facing's finished now and you can complete the side seams of the dress and the side seams of the armhole and the last bit of the facing. So with right sides together, stitch the side seams from the armhole to the hem and neaten and press open. Stitch the side seams of the facing and press open. Neaten these seams using a slight zigzag. Make sure you neaten them separately. If you have an overlocker, you may choose to use the overlocker instead. Complete the stitching of the facing to the armhole. trim this area and neaten the facing edge. You can also neaten the hem edge at this stage. I have neatened the seam by turning over about 0.25 of a centimetre or a quarter of an inch and using a straight stitch to completely cover the raw edge. It gives you a much neater finish. Obviously, if you've got an overlocker, you can use that. As you can see here, it encloses the raw edge completely. Press what you have done so far. As you can see, I'm not using an ironing board for demonstration purposes. You will find it much easier to press the armhole and the neck edge using the end of your ironing board to drape the neck and the armhole over it. Measure and pin up the hem. I prefer to hand stitch this hem. You may like to sew it. And you can see I used a tape measure to check that the allowance is turned up evenly all the way around. When you measure and pin up the hem and get to the centre back area where the split is, turn the hem up first and then press the split in. That puts the seam allowance of the split at the bottom of the hem. Much neater finish. You could make this dress in a floral fabric, which would make it much more of a summer dress and not so much a little black cocktail dress. The pattern is very, very versatile.